Hi, my name is Adam Walls, and I'm an Emmy Award-winning makeup artist. You may have seen my work in projects like NCIS New Orleans. Have you ever wondered what the sculpting and molding process is like when making a silicone prosthetic? Let me show you how it works. When I start a sculpture like this, I like to draw out the basic shape of what I'm going for. In this case, I want to make a fairly large open wound. So I'll use a product called Chavant NSP Medium, which is a clay, and it's easy to spread yet firm enough to hold its shape. I start by making little balls of clay, which I place along my outline. Now here's a little tip with this stuff. You can actually warm up your clay in a toaster oven or another heating element like that. Just set it on a low setting and get it nice and warm. This way it's a little easier to move around on your board. Now there I'm using a rake sculpting tool, and it allows me to smooth out the surface of my sculpture. Your skin is generally a smooth surface, and you want to try to get your sculpture to match that as much as possible. You really want to focus on your edges, because this is the area of the appliance that's going to make or break the effect. Notice how you can see through the clay just a little bit? That's what you're going for. You really want to make sure that the prosthetic will be able to blend out perfectly into the skin. Now I do like this curved paddle tool to get in there and rough up the interior of the wound. Sculpting wound interiors, to be funky if you will, is a great way to go. This pointed liner is actually a makeup brush, but it does a great job in smoothing out your sculpture. Pair this with some 99% alcohol and you can smooth out this clay even more. Notice how even that clay is surrounding the wound? That's what we're looking for. These are some of my detail sculpting tools created by XIEM Tools. These three tools are the workhorses of my sculpting process. They help me create those fine lines, wrinkles, and other details the skin has. Now at this point you can see me jumping back and forth between all the tools that you've seen me use thus far. I'm basically hitting all of those areas that are catching my eye. This just helps me to refine the overall look. I'm using a coarse black sponge because it's similar to the rake tool, and it helps me to refine and further smooth out the surface of the sculpture. Once I get everything smoothed out, I start adding some rough wrinkle lines. Obviously, skin doesn't have lines that extreme, but this is just the first initial pass. These lines will give me a really good pattern and a good base layer to work off of. Now you've noticed me use the fan brush at a couple points so far. Not only is this a great tool for smoothing things out, but it also helps me clean up any little bits of clay that'll build up along your sculpture. The old saying, clean as you go, will only help you in this process. Now that pore texture tool that I'm awkwardly holding in my fingertips, it was once part of a longer tool and it snapped on me. After struggling with its small size, I realized I could attach it to a Fisker's X-Acto blade handle. I just shaved down a little bit and stuck it in there. The point is if you don't have the exact right tool on hand, just get creative and make one. Now if you're paying attention, you can see that I'm using those fine lines that we sculpted earlier as a guide for my pore texture. Well, flag on the play. You can see I'm adding some extra clay to the outside of my sculpture. If I want to put a blood tube underneath this prosthetic and make it a blood gag, I'm going to have to hide that too. Extra length on this prosthetic will help with that. Normally you would want to do a thicker prosthetic for blood gags, but in this case, I'd rather have the option with this one than not. At this point, I really like to work the clay until, at least to my eye, it doesn't look like clay anymore. Go back and noodle around in any different spots that are catching your eye. Make it really look like you've got some torn skin bits in there. And if it looks like you made that mark with a tool, then go back over it again. After that, do a little cleanup if needed, and basically, you're ready to mold your prosthetic. For molding, we use a product called Clean Clay to create a ring around the outside of our sculpture. This does two things. It allows us to capture excess silicone while we run the mold, but it'll eventually work as a silicone handle once we apply it. You can pull those handles to make sure that you get your appliance into the right position. Here I'm gluing stir sticks into place to create a wall around the outside of my sculpture. This will hold our liquid silicone in place as it cures. Once that's completed, I coat the entire sculpture in a thin coat of Krylon Crystal Clear. I had triple thick crystal clear lying around, which honestly tends to be a little too thick for our purposes, but this is an expensive hobby, so I'm going to use what I have. But make sure if you're using this product to use it sparingly. Make sure you get a nice even coat, and make sure you spray all of those details in the middle of your sculpture. Everything, including your stir stick walls, need to be coated. Now if you go too thick with your coats, you'll notice that the material can pool. Once this pooled material dries, it'll leave an awkward texture, and it will show up in your finished mold. You don't want that. While your sculpture is drying, make sure to clean up your workstation. We're going to be using a platinum silicone, which oftentimes can be easy to contaminate, so really make sure that your station is ready to go. The silicone that we're going to be using for our mold is a great product called MoldStar 15 from Smooth On. I really like to use this silicone for my molds because it's durable, it mixes up easily with a 1-to-1 ratio, and it sets in about 8 hours. This gives you plenty of time, which is perfect for evacuating the silicone. When you evacuate your silicone, you're eliminating any gases or bubbles that show up and create imperfections in your mold. The evacuator is a simple device that pulls the excess gases out of your silicone. As this happens, it's going to look like the volume of your silicone is increasing. What's actually happening is the gases are being pulled out, which in turn causes the silicone to expand. Once it expands fully, the silicone collapses. At this point, the bulk of your gases have been released. There's still a little bit remaining in there, so I usually let the silicone sit in there for about a minute longer. Now that we're ready to pour up our mold, I usually start by pouring on one side and I let the silicone gradually fill in and settle into all of those little nooks and crannies naturally. I really want to make sure to give it time to settle into all of those details. If you pour it too quickly into the middle, you run the risk of catching pockets of air underneath. Although, if you do trap an air bubble or two, the 6 to 8 hour setup time usually gives those bubbles time to make it to the surface. Now you can see that I didn't have enough silicone to cover the top of the sculpture, so I poured up an additional 300 grams on top. Since everything is still liquid, it'll all merge together eventually. Once it's dry, you'll notice that your silicone is firm, so you can go ahead and pull off your stir stick wall, and then you should be left with a perfect 1-to-1 match of your sculpture. At this point, I take a second or two to make sure that everything turned out and everything is reflected properly in my mold. And then after a little bit of cleanup, you'll be good to prep your mold and create your silicone prosthetic. Now if you'd like to watch me run that mold, see how a silicone prosthetic gets made, how a blood rig works, how to apply and paint the prosthetic, then check out the next video in the series detailing all of those steps and more. Thanks for watching.